Dice are rolling, darkness falls. Inside the GM Studios halls. Tabletop games where nightmares creep. In a realm where sanity is lost and weak. Welcome to the abyss where dreams shatter. Inside the GM studio, nothing else matters. Blood and chaos, the dark arts unfold. In the realm of role-playing, where legends are told.
Why, welcome back, all of you people, men, middle-aged men. Welcome back to Inside the GM Studio, where me and my co-host will field questions from the internet and riff on the stupidity that is so rife in other games. I am your host, David.
I am Matt.
And so how this works for the uninitiated is I roll a die, a d20, and this week I get a 15, and Matt has collated a list of questions and put them on a scale from 1 to 20 in no particular order from what I could tell. And this one, it's good.
I've been
It's
waiting for
good.
this one. Hold on,
I can
this
tell
is a
it's
good
good. Oh, lay it on me. Lay it on me, son.
All right. So this one comes from Master Weird 5077 on our Ask Game Masters with the title Hosting a Non-High Fantasy Campaign. Hello, Dungeon Masters.
Hello.
I am completely new to this field, so excuse me, please, if I might sound a little dumb. I want to host my first one-shot in a kind of supernatural/mystery kind of setting. How do you handle character building in those kind of worlds? My whole group is new to D&D, but some already know a lot of stuff from Baldur's Gate, etc. I want to give them free choice to build their character. But do you think it's a little silly to have an adventure guild containing a tiefling, a dwarf, and an elf in an investigative mission on werewolf murders in a small town or something like that? How do you handle that in your quote-unquote low fantasy worlds? Do you use the classic D&D characters or something else? Thank you so very much.
Well,
I was really excited for this because when it comes to David, a fan of low fantasy, or not exactly high fantasy when we think of high fantasy, while still running D&D with D&D rules, this is the guy to talk to.
First of all, I think if you have a tiefling, a dwarf, and an elf, you're automatically not paying low fantasy. Low fantasy would not have any of the fantasy races. It would largely just be humans and maybe one or two other kind of errant races here or there, but largely the world will be populated by humans. So I'm not really sure what he's getting at by saying that it's not high fantasy, except that he seems to be saying that it's a fantasy-based RPG that is much more character and mystery driven. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, hold on. So I'm looking at it. So OP says, so people are already talking to him in the comments saying, you're playing the wrong game. If you want to do low fantasy, you should do this and this and this. And what he's saying is, he as the DM wants to do low fantasy, but the players have chosen dwarf, tiefling, elf characters, and he doesn't know how to go about it.
You need to give up on the idea that you're going to play a low fantasy game if that's not what your players want. I mean, that's the simplest answer. But there is some way to kind of like, independent of the world building that is inherent in a game. So low fantasy settings typically hinge on not just the races that are available, but also the magic system, the combat system, the lore and texture, how advanced the world is. Low fantasy worlds are almost always less advanced than high fantasy worlds, right? Like a high fantasy world could be everything from kind of like moderate heroic fantasy, like all the way up to like steampunk, basically post-Renaissance is still going to be high fantasy. But most most low fantasy stuff is going to be kind of like somewhere between Stone Age and early Iron Age, most
Hmm.
likely kind of Bronze Age. Um, so, but independent of that, the key aspect, the key narrative aspect of a low fantasy setting is that the stakes are almost always personal, right? The characters are not noble characters typically. They're morally gray characters, and they're ones that are largely interested in their own narratives. So they do not track with kind of modernist sensibilities about grand narratives, right? Things that are world-changing events, things that are like saving the throngs of the masses, of like restoring kingdoms and all this shit. They're more likely to be motivated by vengeance, by lust, by personal vendettas, by the prospect of wealth, by sheer survival. It means something to them personally, their personal stakes. And this is where the gravity of low fantasy exists, is that you trade off some of the grand scope and maybe more high octane plot beats that come from having something that has world shaking or region shaking capabilities with something a little more personal and grounded, where the players, the characters in the narrative, um, they stand to gain and lose something within that short arc. And also, uh, low fantasy settings tend to have, because the stakes are personal, they tend to have shorter plot arcs. They don't have continuous ongoing things. So they're more grounded and they're more personal and they're more character driven, but at the same time, they're not ongoing or continuous. The player could be seeking vengeance on some cult lord that killed his parents, like in one episode, and then the very next adventure, they're halfway across the world, like seeking glory and gold on some desert island.
Hmm.
Like, and they don't need to even have a through thread or anything, right? They're disjointed because the characters are much more transient. They typically tend to be rakes and scoundrels, and because they're not high fantasy characters, their stakes are grounded, but their persons are much more roguish. You know, they're flying by the seat of their pants because the world is part of the reason it would typically take place in an earlier, less developed time is because you want the world to be harsher. You want the world to be less stable because this says something about your characters who live for today and really are not thinking about the future. They're not trying to do anything other than just kind of eke by and survive and get some gold and find some companions and find their uh, find their joys where they can in micro doses, and then they're just on to the next scenario. This makes it very episodic. It trades off that long form storytelling with the big payoffs for things that are constantly being shaken up, constantly, like, any turn could result in a new conflict of sorts. It's unpredictable. It's very much dynamic in that way. So
Hmm.
if you're doing that, regardless if you have tiefling, elf, dwarf, if you're doing those elements into your fantasy setting, then that's going to feel low fantasy. I don't have a lot of tactics on how to incorporate that with a more investigative or mystery driven narrative.
I
Maybe
don't
you
know.
do, Matt.
I think you already came up with it that just because of the race that you're playing doesn't mean that it can't feel low fantasy. It's
Mhm.
all about how the world feels itself. Like fuck, man. Like I said, um, the setting of Dark Sun on Athos is a low fantasy setting, even
Mhm.
though there's all these races that you can play.
Yeah.
It's a super low fantasy setting. You just got to play it out right. So if you got a dwarf, an elf, and a tiefling, that's all right. Maybe when you go into a city or a tavern, a village, people kind of give the side eye to the tiefling because there's something that you don't see every day, or because they are a tiefling, that means that they have some sort of devil, demon, sort of blood running through them. So people don't, and usually in low fantasy settings, when it comes to magic and things like those, people are very distrusting to that
Yeah.
sort of thing. So when it comes to that, even if people show up in fucking robes, have them kind of give them the side eye, like, I don't like you for reasons of something that you might not know. I'm reading in the comments here, and god damn it, yet again, my nemesis, Duragar, shows up again with his profile pic of a goddamn Stranger Things creature. But he makes a really good point. He, she, I don't care. Whoever they are, Duragar, you are my nemesis. But they say, when they quoted, but do you think it's a little silly to have an adventurers guild containing a tiefling, a dwarf, and an elf in an investigative mission on werewolf murders in a small town or something like that? Duragar says, not really, no. If people are used to elves and dwarves and such beings part of a society, then they just fit right in. Else it can also create interesting conflict where the humans are all quote, well, of course, an elf would be this slow to solve the murder, unquote, etc. If I want to go into actual low fantasy, I run a different game other than D&D, but I do think you can make D&D grounded, especially at low levels. Hell, a lot of openings to the big campaign modules start with some kind of mystery for the lower levels. There are plenty of people running various mysteries in D&D. End of the day, the biggest part of it is getting your players to buy into what you are trying to do. Once they play along with the idea, it gets so much better. Also, as new players and GMs just do stuff, see what works and what doesn't. Experience is the best teacher. I like this idea because when it comes to the GM and you start to play in that game, you start to feel where that GM wants the tech level, where the world is at, uh, like where David and I big time differ. Well, especially because I just know when I'm playing with David. Actually, no, that's not true. Sometimes David does. He throws me for a loop and he makes it a little bit more high fantasy than I'm used to for his worlds that he makes. This usually happens when he's doing more of a pre-written campaign. You might go with it a little bit more, but every now and then he was like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do it the David way. And we're just going to do a little bit more low fantasy, where I'm sure that David knows as well. Whenever I play shit, I am very high fantasy in a lot of things that I do.
It's
But it's also a part of the session zero, as we always talk about, as well as that first session that you give them to kind of give them that idea of where we want the anchor to be in our level of play.
Yeah, we usually, you and I, it seems as though you want high fantasy, I typically want low fantasy, and we usually just compromise on kind of
Mm-hmm.
somewhere in the heroic fantasy. It's
Yes,
not
very much so.
it's not quite high fantasy where you have like it's not that maybe airships don't
Yeah,
exist.
teleportation circles and
Right, they're just not like institutionalized,
right.
right? Like in a high fantasy world, it's like they would be institutionalized. You
Yep.
would each city would have a fleet of airships.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like no, like I'm fine with airships being a thing in the world, but they're not like super common. And that's usually kind of where you are with low fantasy where most of the enemies are not going to be supernatural enemies. The supernatural is reserved for things that are like exemplary and incredibly dangerous, just like you were
Mm-hmm.
saying with the magic system. It's not so much a problem that you have a tiefling, a dwarf, and an elf. It would be more a problem if you had a mage, a warlock, and a cleric as
Yeah.
classes,
Mm-hmm.
because those are just not, those are heavily reliant on spellcasting, and spellcasting is supernatural, and so um, those things are usually associated with danger, with evil, with corruption. Again, this is all toward the thesis of making the world feel hostile. And similarly with like werewolves, like you're investigating like werewolf murders, you need to do a good job of making the characters be acutely aware that this is something that is incredibly rare. It is so and consequently incredibly dangerous, um, and that is kind of where you're at with that. Like when it comes to like you can have like a mystery investigation and have it still be low fantasy, but it just you just have to ensure that they're not saving the world and they're not likely
Mm.
doing it for noble reasons. They're doing it I don't want to say selfish reasons, but
I don't know. Well, because like how you were talking about how because it's a werewolf, that it's very rare, and
Mhm.
it, I don't know. The writer keeps saying that it's a part of a like a guild that they're dealing with, which I mean, they might just be talking about a party. But
yeah.
either way, if you are dealing with a guild, like an adventurer slash hunters guild, and you start dealing with werewolves, perhaps they give you a certain amount of payout because it's so rare.
But see, this is what I was going to say is the werewolves are less of a problem than the guild. A
Mhm.
guild is not low fantasy stuff, right? A
Yeah.
guild is a very like advanced, more advanced
Yes.
society, more cohesive things. You know, you have an adventurers guild, you have a mages guild, you have a whatever guild. They're like trade unions and shit.
Yep.
You go back to like borderline prehistoric Bronze Age times. People aren't organizing and mobilizing into that capacity. Like people organize into cities or to towns, but largely they don't have these sophisticated like collective bargaining agreements and shit that you would in more modern times. And
Hmm.
again, that's part of what makes it feel you want it to feel more like the Wild West, like the frontier, right? So think about it, same era, right? Let's say the what late mid to late 1800s, right? Where you would choose to set something in the mid to late 1800s would govern its genre. If you set it in the American West, it's going to feel more sword and sorcery, low fantasy because everything is dangerous, everything is wide open, there are no rules, there are no laws. Whereas if you wanted it to, in the mid to late 1800s, if you wanted it to feel more high fantasy, you would set it in like London, where everything is like, it's the same era, but like how established and cohesive the society is. I mean, this is the Jack the Ripper, Sherlock Holmes kind of like, those are the same time frame in the world. Like but the themes and the genres are very different. Like a Sherlock Holmes mystery and like an old west settler frontier kind of mindset, although they might be in the same era, they're worlds apart thematically. And so
Hmm.
that's the terms you need to be thinking of as far as like your particular genre goes with this game.
Well, here, David. So Das Jingo in our Twitch chat just asked, "Can't you have organized societies, but the world is low magic because of the scarcity of magic, rather than how societally advanced the world is?"
I mean, sure, there's nothing that prevents people from like forming organizations, but typically think of macro organizations are almost always predicated on abundance of wealth,
Hmm.
and let's just say an abundance of resources, right? So like you can't have a guild that has a towering guild hall and like a fleet of horses at its disposal or whatever, because that's kind of part and parcel for what a guild is. It has collective resources at
Yeah,
its disposal in a
taxes.
right, in a world that's incredibly hostile. Part of it being incredibly hostile is that resources are incredibly scarce, right? I mean, like to the point where most low fantasy stuff would even be like stuff that's made of like steel is like rare and valuable
Hmm.
because it's steel, it's not iron, it's not bronze, right? And so like this is, you're not talking about an abundance of, like in a high fantasy setting, like steel is just everywhere, right? Like that's a thing. And you know low fantasy is likely like stone weapons and everything. So it's like macro organizations would likely they would be predicated on the availability of resources and the ability of the characters to ascertain those resources, right? Like if you don't have steel readily available, then mining becomes pretty difficult. And
Hmm.
so mining precious metals and stuff like that also becomes very difficult. Like if you don't have the technology that would allow you to smelt something at a high enough temperature that would allow you to produce steel, then steel becomes all the more valuable. And so like that's a trickle down effect. I don't think there's anything that precludes larger organizations, but typically in a low fantasy setting, large large mobilizations are typically up to no good. They're warlords that are like mobilizing the masses toward tyranny. They're cults that are largely like, polluting people's minds. They're sorcerers that are,
You're almost there. You're almost
yeah.
there. Sorcerer Kings. That's what we're
Yeah.
looking for. The
Right, right. So
the epitome of low fantasy villain, the Sorcerer King.
yeah, and so, the cult leader, the sorcerer king, the
Hmm.
tyrant, the warlord, these things are all like, part and parcel. They're large scale mobilizations, but cooperative groups like something like a guild or like a co-op, a farmers co-op or whatever, are only possible when it's not every man for himself scraping by on every like resource that he could
Hmm.
possibly have. Like you're much less likely to cooperate with somebody if you're concerned with how much you have to eat, the livelihood of your family and your person. You're going to be more of a silo, and that is what makes the world feel dangerous, and it's part
Hmm.
of what communicates the stakes of the game. And so if you're not interested in that, then you need to move to more to heroic fantasy or high fantasy.
Definitely, definitely. Again, talking about if you're going to be playing D&D and if you want to try that low fantasy, I highly suggest if you cannot think of it yourself, look at Dark Sun because in Athos, the terrain itself, the world itself can kill you. Uh,
Hmm.
they haven't made an official Dark Sun for fifth edition yet. They've been hinting at it for fucking ever, and I can't wait to see what they do with it. But just walking out into the deserts of Athos is you got to start making saving throws because it's really difficult, as well as the sorcerer kings that rule the entire area. But oh yeah, we're not even talking about how magic is ruining everything. Magic is the worst thing ever, and it ruins the world. That's why the whole world is nothing but desert. But it doesn't matter. Like I gotta say, like it doesn't matter if you want these crazy fantasy races. It's how you make the world feel. Like David
Hmm.
was saying, if you have a guild, then you have taxation, you have a reason for organization. We're talking low fantasy, dude. We're talking about Conan. We're talking about fucking, all we're doing here is we're going out, we're killing monsters to make things better, or I bring you a horn and you give me some gold in order
Yeah.
for me to eat and drink tonight. That's
Right.
all it
It's
is.
like the whole concept of currency is probably still in its
Yeah.
infancy. Like currency as opposed to just like a literal trade and barter system. Currency is still in its infancy. And so yeah, that's yeah, guilds with taxation and all of that is just not going to be tenable.
Hmm.
I also don't think that an investigation style mystery game, maybe mystery, but not an investigation style game is really conducive to low fantasy because frankly most of the people are going like investigation is a high-minded concept. And it's so part of the reason investigation or part of the reason Sherlock Holmes being set where it is perfect is because society is advanced enough to be high-minded but not so advanced that you can lean on any sort of technology to do the legwork for you. So
Right.
it lives in that perfect detective story um, world. Um, and a low fantasy world, the people aren't likely to be. You'll be like, well, that doesn't make any sense. He doesn't have motive, means, and opportunity, and the general authorities and general population are going to be like, dude, he's a sorcerer, just kill him. Like it's
Yeah.
like they're not like logic and rationale and reasoning. They're going to be borderline primal people, and so a high-minded investigation would be predicated at least a little bit on having like a villain that is um that is like clever enough to like hide the brushstrokes and to elude capture and all that. Where in a sword and sorcery world, it's more the more terrifying aspect of it is that in that world, it's such a savage environment that like a group of marauders can just saunter into a village, kill everybody, rape their women, and take all of their goods, and then just saunter off to the hills, and there are no consequences.
Hmm.
If the heroes don't do something about it, there's no authority that will stop them. This is where the tension of a frontier kind of dynamic is interesting, but it doesn't really lend itself to like investigation so much because that's just more of a you need all the trappings and structures of society for there to be a mystery because the bad guys are likely trying to elude um capture, they're trying to elude and cover their tracks, and the players are unraveling it. But in a Wild West sort of situation, a frontier kind of thing, there isn't likely to be any of that. It's just like I just clunk you
Mm.
over the head and I take your shit and I go away and no one stops me because I'm a bad person. But like, so what? It's like there's no sheriff in this town because why would there be? Like
True. I think our viewer here in Twitch, Das Jingo, brings us to a good ending note. Genre informs the expectations of the world, whether it be magic level or a societal organization. But are the players and GMs on the same page of of the genre expectation, uh, what it entails, and what it implies? This is the best thing when it comes to your. Remember, folks out there, session zero, big time, good things. If you want to have a low fantasy and you feel weird that your players are choosing dwarf, elf, tiefling, fucking exit, dude. It's cool. It's fine. It's totally cool. Let your players know what you want. If this is the world that you want to run, let them know, hey, this is what I want to do. It's totally cool. If they're not down with it, then compromise. David knows that shit. I know that. I've done it plenty of times. David has done it way more than I have. Because normally my players just bend a knee to me. I don't know what it is about me, but I say, do what I say, and they say, okay. But when David says it, we go, eh.
damn.
All right. You got anything to end on there? You got any thoughts there, David?
No, I think that's a salient point and probably a good one to end on.
All right, good. Then let's just leave this one with a good night.
And good luck.